The claim that 536 AD was the worst year in recorded human history is a modern analytical formulation. No surviving 6th century author characterized the year in such terms, nor did contemporaries possess the comparative chronological range required to rank their experience against earlier or later catastrophes. Any assessment of 536 as the worst year depends on retrospective analysis using interdisciplinary evidence. The phrase functions as a heuristic, not a literal judgment, and must be evaluated according to clearly defined criteria and evidentiary limits. In this context, recorded human history refers primarily to regions for which written sources survive and can be supplemented by archaeological and environmental proxy data. These include the Eastern Roman Mediterranean, parts of Western and Northern Europe, the Near East, and East Asia. Regions lacking sustained textual records for the 6th century are not excluded from historical experience, but they cannot be assessed with the same resolution. Conclusions drawn here do not imply uniform global conditions. Historical catastrophe is not assessed by a single metric. Comparative disaster historiography emphasizes that no standardized method exists for ranking years or events. Different studies prioritize different criteria, including mortality, duration, geographic extent, economic impact, or institutional disruption. In the case of the mid-6th century, modern scholarship has focused on 5 interrelated dimensions: climatic severity, subsistence disruption, demographic vulnerability, economic contraction, and political or administrative resilience. The relative weighting of these criteria is interpretive and remains debated. Climatic severity concerns the scale, duration, and geographic extent of environmental anomalies relative to established norms. Subsistence disruption addresses the impact of such anomalies on agricultural production, food availability, and distribution systems. Demographic vulnerability refers not only to mortality, but to population exposure to famine, disease, and displacement under sustained stress. Economic contraction encompasses reductions in production, exchange, and fiscal capacity, as evidenced by material culture and administrative continuity or strain. Political and administrative resilience examines whether states and institutions continue to function, adapt, or fragment under pressure. The prominence of climate in analyses of 536 reflects the availability of independent proxy data rather than an assumption of climatic determinism. Ice cores and tree rings provide unusually precise evidence for environmental conditions in this period. Climate is treated here as a significant contextual factor whose effects depend on interaction with social, economic, and political structures. Monocausal explanations are explicitly rejected. Within this framework, 536 AD is not evaluated as an isolated 12-month episode. It is analyzed as the initial, securely dated threshold within a broader crisis interval extending approximately from 536 to 550 AD. The year is significant because it marks the first convergence of independent contemporary testimony describing an unprecedented atmospheric anomaly and environmental proxy evidence indicating abrupt climatic disruption. Later developments are assessed as part of a cumulative sequence rather than as consequences mechanically produced by a single event. The lower chronological boundary of this analysis extends back to approximately 500 AD to establish baseline conditions. The upper boundary at approximately 550 AD corresponds to the conclusion of the initial cluster of major volcanic forcing events identified in ice core records and the first sustained phase of the Justinianic Plague. Transformations occurring later in the 7th century fall outside this defined analytical scope. Distinguishing between attested fact, scholarly interpretation, and uncertainty is essential. Attested facts include contemporary descriptions of unusual environmental conditions, securely dated sulfate deposition in ice cores, dendrochronological growth suppression, and material evidence, such as settlement continuity or contraction. Scholarly interpretations involve linking these data into explanatory models, such as attributing atmospheric anomalies to volcanic eruptions or assessing the relationship between environmental stress and subsistence systems. Uncertainty remains where evidence is fragmentary, indirect, or absent, particularly in quantifying mortality or reconstructing conditions in regions with limited documentation. Modern interest in 536 AD has been shaped by advances in paleoclimatology, dendrochronology, and archaeological science over the past several decades. These methods have allowed historians to synchronize environmental proxy data with late antique chronologies, providing independent corroboration of events described in textual sources. The year 536 was known to specialists long before this research, but interdisciplinary integration has elevated it from a chronicle-noted anomaly to a focal point of late antique environmental history. Public-facing descriptions of 536 as the worst year often simplify this scholarship by emphasizing a singular catastrophe. Academic treatments emphasize instead the interaction of multiple stresses over time. Other years in history witnessed higher documented mortality or more immediate political collapse. What distinguishes 536 within this analytical framework is its role as the onset of a prolonged, geographically extensive period of compounded stress, rather than its outcomes within a single calendar year. Comparisons across eras must also account for differences in documentation, population size, and social organization. Mortality figures for the 6th century cannot be reconstructed with the precision available for later periods. Consequently, assessments rely on relative indicators such as duration, geographic spread, and systemic interaction rather than absolute numbers. By defining worst year as an analytical problem rather than a rhetorical claim, this documentary adopts a comparative, evidence-based approach. The question addressed is whether 536 AD marks the beginning of an unusually severe and consequential crisis interval when evaluated across multiple dimensions within the limits of available evidence. This framing allows analysis to proceed without exaggeration while preserving historical specificity. At the opening of the 6th century, the societies that would be affected by the events of 536 AD were operating within established political, economic, and environmental parameters. This period, often categorized by modern historians as late antiquity, was neither an era of uniform stability nor one of inevitable decline. Instead, it was characterized by administrative continuity, long-distance exchange, agrarian dependence, and recurring but generally manageable environmental variability. Understanding these baseline conditions is essential for evaluating whether the disruptions that began in 536 represented an extension of existing trends or a departure from them. In the Eastern Roman Empire, administrative structures inherited from the late Roman state remained largely intact after 500 AD. Imperial authority extended across the Eastern Mediterranean, encompassing the Balkans, Anatolia, the Levant, Egypt, and North Africa. The fiscal system was anchored in land taxation, assessed through cadastral surveys, and collected in cash or kind. Coinage continued to be minted in large quantities, particularly gold solidi and copper denominations, facilitating state payments and regional exchange. Archaeological evidence from urban centers such as Constantinople, Antioch, Alexandria, and Ephesus indicates continued occupation, maintenance of public infrastructure, and commercial activity during the early decades of the century. Primary sources from this period reflect administrative routine rather than crisis. Legal compilations associated with the reign of Justinian, initiated after his accession in 527 AD, presuppose a functioning bureaucracy capable of codification and enforcement. Procopius, writing later in the century, describes military campaigns and court politics of the 520s and early 530s without reference to systemic breakdown in agriculture or climate. These sources do not present a society on the verge of environmental collapse. Beyond the Eastern Roman sphere, the Sasanian Empire governed a vast territory extending from Mesopotamia into Iran and Central Asia. Its economy was similarly grounded in agriculture, supported by irrigation networks in regions such as Mesopotamia and Kazakhstan. Administrative documentation from this period is limited compared to Roman sources, but archaeological evidence indicates continuity in settlement patterns and agricultural production in many areas during the early 6th century. Diplomatic and military interactions between the Eastern Roman and Sasanian states in the 520s and early 530s suggest that both polities possessed sufficient resources to sustain prolonged conflict and negotiation. Western Europe, though politically fragmented after the dissolution of the Western Roman imperial court in the late 5th century, did not experience uniform economic collapse. Successor kingdoms in Italy, Gaul, and Iberia maintained administrative practices derived from Roman precedent, including taxation, law, and urban governance, albeit at a reduced. East Asia provides an independent point of comparison. Chinese dynastic histories record environmental conditions, harvest outcomes, and social unrest with regularity. In the early 6th century, these sources describe political fragmentation and warfare during the Northern and Southern dynasties period, but they do not indicate sustained hemispheric-scale climatic anomalies before the mid-530s. Agricultural production, though regionally affected by conflict, followed established seasonal patterns. Environmental conditions across these regions before 536 AD are best understood through a combination of textual references and paleoclimatic proxies. Dendrochronological records from Europe and Asia show year-to-year variability in temperature and precipitation during the late 5th and early 6th centuries, including cooler phases in the mid-5th century. These fluctuations, however, fall within the range of variability known for the period and do not indicate a sustained, abrupt anomaly immediately preceding 536. Ice core records likewise do not show sulfate spikes of the magnitude observed in the mid-530s during the decades immediately before that year. This baseline variability is important. Late antique societies were accustomed to managing environmental uncertainty through storage, trade, and administrative intervention. Grain reserves in Egypt supplied Constantinople and other urban centers. Riverine transport along the Nile, Danube, and Euphrates facilitated redistribution. Taxation systems allowed states to extract surplus during good years and, in some cases, to mitigate shortages during poor ones. These mechanisms did not eliminate risk, but they provided buffers against short-term fluctuations. Demographic conditions before 536 are difficult to quantify precisely. No census data survives that would allow population estimates with modern precision. Archaeological indicators such as settlement density, housing construction, and burial frequency suggest relative stability in many regions during the early 6th century. There is no evidence for a generalized demographic collapse in the decades immediately preceding 536. Where population decline occurred, it was typically localized and attributable to warfare or political upheaval rather than environmental factors alone. Trade networks also remained active. Amphora distributions indicate continued movement of agricultural products, including olive oil and wine, across the Mediterranean. Coin finds demonstrate the circulation of imperial currency into rural areas, suggesting integration of local economies into broader fiscal systems. These patterns support the conclusion that economic life before 536, while uneven and regionally differentiated, operated within established norms. Climatic expectations during this period were shaped by experience rather than formal measurement. Agricultural calendars, reflected in estate management texts and seasonal references in chronicles, assumed predictable sequences of planting, growth, and harvest. Deviations occurred, but they were generally short-lived and geographically limited. The absence of widespread commentary on abnormal weather in sources from the early 6th century suggests that no extraordinary climatic disturbance was perceived as ongoing before the mid-530s. It is important to distinguish between structural vulnerability and imminent crisis. Late antique societies were structurally vulnerable in the sense that they depended heavily on annual agricultural output and were sensitive to sustained disruption. This vulnerability, however, does not imply that a crisis was already unfolding. Administrative continuity, economic exchange, and demographic stability indicate that, before 536, these societies functioned within parameters they had adapted to over generations. Modern scholarship emphasizes this distinction to avoid retrospective determinism. Earlier interpretations sometimes portrayed the 6th century as a period of inevitable decline culminating in later transformations. More recent work, drawing on archaeological continuity and environmental data, rejects this view. The conditions of the early 6th century provided both resilience and exposure. Resilience through established institutions and practices, exposure through dependence on stable climatic conditions. Regional differences mattered significantly. Mediterranean agriculture benefited from longer growing seasons and diversified crops, while northern regions operated closer to subsistence margins. Irrigation-dependent systems in the Near East and parts of the Sasanian realm were productive but vulnerable to disruption. These differences shaped how subsequent environmental stress would be experienced, but they do not indicate that stress was already present in an exceptional form before 536. The years immediately preceding 536 also included periods of political and military activity that demonstrate functional state capacity. Justinian's early reign saw military campaigns, diplomatic initiatives, and legal reforms that required predictable revenue and logistical support. The Sasanian state likewise engaged in military and diplomatic actions without evidence of systemic resource failure. Such activities would have been difficult to sustain under conditions of widespread environmental crisis. In 536 AD, multiple observers across widely separated regions recorded an environmental phenomenon that they regarded as unprecedented within living memory. Their accounts, preserved in different literary traditions and languages, describe a prolonged diminution of sunlight, accompanied by abnormal atmospheric conditions. These reports are notable not for their interpretive explanations, which are largely absent, but for their consistency in describing what was seen and experienced. The convergence of these independent testimonies forms the primary documentary basis for identifying 536 AD as the onset of an extraordinary environmental disruption. One of the most frequently cited accounts comes from Procopius of Caesarea, writing in the Eastern Roman Empire. In his work Wars, Book 4, Chapter 14, Procopius notes that during this period, the sun gave forth its light without brightness, like the moon, during the whole year. He further compares the phenomenon to a persistent eclipse, though he does not suggest an astronomical cause. Procopius was an educated observer with access to imperial circles, accustomed to describing unusual events when they bore relevance to political or military affairs. His decision to record this observation indicates that it was perceived as exceptional rather than as a routine meteorological fluctuation. Procopius does not provide a precise date for the onset of the phenomenon within 536 AD, nor does he specify exact durations in months. His phrasing suggests that the dimming persisted for an extended period, approximating a year in length. The lack of chronological precision is characteristic of late antique historiography, which rarely recorded environmental events with calendrical specificity unless they coincided with religious festivals or political milestones. This imprecision does not weaken the account's value. Instead, it requires careful correlation with other sources. A second, independent testimony comes from Cassiodorus, a Roman aristocrat and administrator writing from Italy. In a letter preserved in his Varii, Book 11, Letter 39, dated to the mid-530s, Cassiodorus describes a sun that appears bluish, weak, and lacking in customary warmth. He notes that shadows are faint, the sun's rays lack heat, and the seasons no longer follow expected patterns. Cassiodorus frames his remarks within an administrative and rhetorical context, addressing provincial officials and landholders. His purpose is not to speculate on causes, but to acknowledge abnormal conditions affecting agricultural expectations. Cassiodorus's account is significant because it situates the phenomenon within the Western Mediterranean, geographically distant from Procopius' Eastern perspective. Italy in the 530s remained integrated into Mediterranean climatic systems, but it was also politically and administratively distinct. The appearance of similar descriptions in both Eastern and Western Roman contexts suggests that the phenomenon was not localized. A third major testimony comes from John of Ephesus, a Syriac-speaking ecclesiastical historian writing in the eastern provinces of the empire. In his Ecclesiastical History, Book 6, John describes a great and fearful sign, in which the sun was darkened for a period extending over more than a year. He emphasizes the persistence of the darkness and associates it with widespread distress, including crop failure and famine in some areas. Like Procopius and Cassiodorus, John does not attempt to provide a natural explanation. His account reflects the perspective of communities in the Near East, adding a further regional dimension. John of Ephesus' testimony is particularly valuable because it reflects a tradition independent of the classical Latin and Greek historiographical schools. Writing in Syriac, he addressed audiences whose cultural and ecclesiastical contexts differed from those of Constantinople or Rome. The similarity of his description to those of Procopius and the geographic distribution of these accounts is striking. Procopius represents the Eastern Mediterranean. Cassiodorus represents Italy and the Western Mediterranean. John of Ephesus represents the Near East. Irish annals reflect the memory of events in northwestern Europe. While these sources differ in genre, purpose, and proximity to the events, they converge in reporting a sustained abnormality rather than a transient weather event. Equally significant is what these sources do not contain. None of the contemporary authors attributes the phenomenon to divine punishment, celestial warfare, or specific astronomical events such as comets or eclipses. Late antique writers were not reluctant to propose supernatural explanations when they deemed them appropriate. The relative restraint in these accounts suggests that the phenomenon defied familiar explanatory categories. This absence of interpretation does not imply skepticism. It reflects uncertainty. Chronological precision remains a challenge. Most accounts place the phenomenon in or around 536 AD, but few specify whether it began in winter, spring, or summer. Some modern reconstructions propose a spring or early summer onset based on correlations with tree-ring data and later climatic proxies. These reconstructions, however, remain scholarly interpretations rather than directly attested facts. What can be stated with confidence is that the dimming was observed during 536 AD and persisted into 537 AD, with varying intensity reported across regions. The duration of the phenomenon is another area requiring careful distinction between observation and inference. Procopius' reference to the whole year may reflect rhetorical convention rather than a precise 12-month interval. John of Ephesus' description of more than a year suggests a longer persistence. Cassiodorus implies prolonged disruption of seasonal expectations rather than a discrete event. Taken together, these accounts indicate a multi-seasonal phenomenon rather than a brief episode. The content of the descriptions points to specific atmospheric characteristics. References to a bluish or pale sun, weak shadows, and diminished warmth align with conditions produced by atmospheric aerosols scattering sunlight. While such an interpretation belongs to modern scientific analysis rather than contemporary understanding, it is notable that the sensory details recorded by these authors are consistent with reduced surface irradiance rather than total obscuration. Archaeological evidence from the mid-6th century does not provide direct visual confirmation of the darkened sun, but it offers contextual support. In several regions, archaeological layers dating to the late 530s and early 540s show signs of stress, including reduced building activity or changes in material deposition. These indicators are not uniform and cannot be attributed solely to environmental factors, but they align temporally with the written reports. Numismatic evidence from 536 AD itself does not show an immediate cessation of minting or circulation. Coins continued to be produced and distributed in the Eastern Roman Empire, suggesting that administrative systems remained functional at the onset of the phenomenon. This observation is important for interpretation. The darkened sun did not coincide with instantaneous economic collapse. Instead, it marked the beginning of conditions that would exert pressure over time. Modern scholarship emphasizes the independence of the contemporary accounts. Procopius, Cassiodorus, and John of Ephesus wrote for different audiences and purposes. There is no evidence that they drew on a shared source for their descriptions of the phenomenon. Their convergence increases confidence that they were describing a real, widely experienced event rather than repeating literary motifs. At the same time, the limitations of the sources must be acknowledged. None provides quantitative measurements of temperature, light intensity, or duration. None offers a precise geographic boundary. None describes conditions outside the regions known to them. The absence of records from some areas cannot be interpreted as evidence that the phenomenon was not experienced there. It reflects the uneven survival of sources. Modern historians have debated whether similar descriptions appear in other periods. While late antique texts occasionally mention unusual weather, the clustering of such reports around 536 AD is unusual. Earlier 5th century sources do not describe a comparable, prolonged dimming of the sun across multiple regions. This relative uniqueness within the textual record contributes to the identification of 536 as a threshold year. The question of perception also requires restraint. Contemporary authors did not possess a global perspective. Their accounts reflect local observation interpreted through cultural frameworks. When Procopius compares the sun to the moon, he employs a metaphor familiar to his audience, not a scientific analogy. Cassiodorus' emphasis on weakened shadows reflects practical concerns related to agriculture and estate management. John of Ephesus' language reflects ecclesiastical discourse and concern for communal suffering. These differences in emphasis do not undermine the underlying observation. Taken together, the contemporary reports from 536 AD establish several points with reasonable confidence. First, an abnormal atmospheric phenomenon was widely observed across the Eastern Roman world and beyond. Second, the phenomenon persisted for an extended period spanning multiple seasons. Third, it was perceived as exceptional by observers accustomed to environmental variability. Fourth, contemporaries did not agree on its meaning or cause, and often refrained from explanation. These points form the documentary foundation upon which further analysis must build. The written sources alone cannot identify the cause of the darkened sun, quantify its climatic impact, or trace its full consequences. They establish that something unusual occurred and that it was sufficiently widespread to attract attention across diverse regions. Subsequent analysis requires correlating these testimonies with independent lines of evidence preserved in natural archives. The significance of the 536 accounts lies not in their interpretive content, which is limited, but in their convergence. Late antique historiography rarely provides such alignment across geographic and cultural boundaries for environmental phenomena. This convergence distinguishes 536 AD within the textual record and warrants further investigation using archaeological and scientific data. The darkened sun of 536 AD, as described by contemporaries, marks the first clearly documented signal of an environmental disruption that would unfold over subsequent years. The written evidence does not describe an immediate catastrophe, but it records a departure from expected conditions that contemporaries recognized as abnormal. This recognition, preserved in multiple independent sources, anchors the chronology of the mid-6th century crisis and provides the starting point for integrating environmental proxy evidence. The written testimonies describing unusual atmospheric conditions in 536 AD acquire analytical weight when examined alongside independent environmental evidence preserved in natural archives. These archives, principally polar ice cores, and annually resolved tree ring series provide physical records of past climate conditions that can be dated with high precision. When synchronized with late antique chronologies, they allow historians and scientists to verify whether the observations recorded by contemporary authors correspond to measurable environmental change. Ice cores extracted from Greenland and Antarctica preserve layered accumulations of snowfall that compact into ice over time. Each annual layer traps atmospheric particles, including volcanic aerosols, dust, and chemical compounds. Sulfate ions, in particular, serve as indicators of major volcanic eruptions, as explosive volcanism injects sulfur dioxide into the stratosphere, where it oxidizes into sulfate aerosols. These aerosols can remain aloft for 1 to several years, dispersing across hemispheres before gradually settling. Multiple ice core records show a pronounced sulfate spike dated securely to 536 AD. This signal is observed in cores from both Greenland and Antarctica, indicating that the event had hemispheric and likely near-global atmospheric reach. The magnitude of the sulfate deposition exceeds background levels and stands out clearly against preceding decades, which show no comparable spikes of similar scale. This physical evidence establishes that a substantial aerosol loading event occurred in or very near 536 AD. The dating of these ice core layers is based on annual stratigraphy, supplemented by reference horizons such as known volcanic eruptions in later periods. While minor uncertainties of 1 to 2 years can occur in deep cores, the convergence of multiple independent cores strengthens chronological confidence. Quantitative reconstructions derived from tree ring data estimate summer temperature reductions of approximately 1.5 to 2.5 degrees Celsius below late antique averages in parts of the northern hemisphere during 536 to 537. These values represent significant departures in pre-industrial climates, particularly in regions already operating near agricultural thresholds. Such reductions would have shortened growing seasons, delayed crop maturation, and reduced yields, even without complete crop failure. The concurrence of ice core sulfate peaks and tree ring growth suppression establishes a strong correlation between atmospheric aerosol loading and surface climate effects. Modern climate modeling supports this linkage. Simulations of large volcanic eruptions show that stratospheric sulfate aerosols scatter incoming solar radiation, reducing the amount of energy reaching Earth's surface. This process, known as reduced surface irradiance, leads to cooler temperatures, especially during summer months, and can disrupt precipitation patterns. It is critical to distinguish between observed data and inferred mechanisms. The ice cores and tree rings provide direct evidence of sulfate deposition and growth suppression. The interpretation that these resulted from volcanic eruptions and aerosol-induced cooling is a scholarly inference grounded in modern atmospheric science. While the precise eruption or eruptions responsible remain debated, the physical mechanism linking aerosols to reduced irradiance is well established through observation of historically documented eruptions, such as those in the modern period. The temporal pattern of the environmental signals further supports this interpretation. The initial sulfate spike, dated to 536 AD, is followed by continued climatic suppression into 537 and, in some regions, beyond. Tree ring data indicate that recovery was not immediate, suggesting that aerosols persisted in the atmosphere for multiple seasons. This duration aligns with expectations for large stratospheric injections, which can affect the climate for 1 to 3 years, depending on scale and latitude. Archaeological evidence, while less precise in annual resolution, provides contextual support. In some regions, layers dated to the late 530s and early 540s show signs of reduced construction activity or shifts in material culture. These changes are not uniform and cannot be attributed solely to climate, but they occur within the same temporal window identified by environmental proxies. Archaeology thus complements, rather than replaces, the environmental record. Numismatic evidence further illustrates the complexity of the response. Coinage production and circulation did not cease in 536 or 537. Mints in the Eastern Roman Empire continued to operate, and coins from these years are found across imperial territories. This continuity demonstrates that the environmental shock did not immediately translate into administrative collapse. Instead, it underscores the distinction between environmental forcing and social outcomes, reinforcing the need to avoid monocausal interpretations. The geographic extent of the environmental signals deserves careful treatment. Ice core data confirm hemispheric atmospheric effects, while tree ring records are strongest in the northern hemisphere due to data availability. Evidence from East Asia, including tree ring series and later historical climatological reconstructions, also indicates cooling during the same interval. This convergence suggests that the climatic effects of the 536 aerosol event were not confined to the Mediterranean or Europe. At the same time, the magnitude of impact varied regionally. Climate models and proxy data indicate that high-latitude and continental interiors experience stronger cooling than some maritime regions. Precipitation responses also differed, with some areas becoming drier and others experiencing altered seasonal rainfall. These variations help explain why historical consequences differed across regions, even though the underlying atmospheric driver was widespread. One area of ongoing scholarly discussion concerns the exact sequence of environmental events. Some ice core datasets suggest additional sulfate deposition around 540 AD, implying a second major volcanic eruption. This later event appears distinct from the 536 signal and may have contributed to prolonged climatic stress. However, the focus here remains on the initial verification of the 536 anomaly. The existence of subsequent events does not diminish the significance of the first, but it complicates interpretations of recovery and duration. Another point of debate involves the latitude of the eruption or eruptions responsible for the 536 sulfate spike. High-latitude eruptions tend to produce asymmetric hemispheric effects, while tropical eruptions can distribute aerosols globally. Geochemical analysis of tephra fragments in some ice cores has been used to argue for a high-latitude northern hemisphere source, possibly in the North Atlantic region. These findings remain under discussion, and attribution is not yet definitive. Despite these uncertainties, the combined evidence establishes several points with high confidence. First, an extraordinary atmospheric aerosol event occurred around 536 AD. Second, this event produced measurable climatic effects, including reduced surface irradiance and summer cooling, lasting at least into 537. Third, the scale and abruptness of the anomaly exceed those observed in the preceding decades, marking a departure from normal late antique variability. The strength of this conclusion lies in the independence of the datasets. Ice cores and tree rings are derived from different physical processes and geographic contexts, yet they converge on the same interval. Their agreement with contemporary written observations strengthens the reliability of both types of evidence. Where texts describe dimmed sunlight and weakened warmth, proxies register reduced irradiance and suppressed growth. Limitations must be acknowledged. Environmental proxies cannot directly measure human perception or social impact. They do not specify how communities experienced or interpreted climatic stress. Conversely, textual sources cannot quantify temperature change or aerosol concentration. The integration of these datasets requires careful correlation without conflation. Each provides a distinct line of evidence that must be interpreted within its own constraints. Modern peer-reviewed scholarship emphasizes this interdisciplinary approach. Studies combining historical analysis with paleoclimatology have demonstrated that neither type of evidence alone is sufficient to reconstruct events such as those of 536 AD. Together, however, they allow for a more robust reconstruction than either could provide independently. The environmental verification of the 536 anomaly does not, by itself, explain subsequent developments. It establishes that a significant, externally driven climatic perturbation occurred. How societies responded depended on a range of factors, including agricultural practices, storage capacity, trade networks, and administrative intervention. Environmental stress created conditions under which vulnerabilities could be exposed, but it did not determine outcomes in a uniform or mechanical way. The physical evidence also clarifies why contemporaries may have perceived the phenomenon as unprecedented. Late antique societies lacked instruments to measure irradiance or temperature, but they were sensitive to deviations from expected seasonal patterns. Reduced sunlight, cooler summers, and altered growing conditions would have been readily apparent to agrarian communities. The persistence of these conditions over more than one season would have reinforced the perception of abnormality. By anchoring the written testimonies of 536 AD in independent environmental records, historians can move beyond anecdotal description to establish a firm empirical basis for the event. This verification does not eliminate uncertainty regarding cause, duration, or impact, but it constrains the range of plausible explanations. The anomaly was real, large in scale, and climatically significant. The integration of ice core and tree ring evidence thus marks a critical step in understanding the mid-6th century crisis. It transforms disparate observations into a coherent environmental narrative grounded in measurable data. This narrative provides the foundation for examining how sustained climatic stress interacted with social, economic, and political systems over the subsequent years. The environmental anomaly identified for 536 AD represents a departure from the patterns observed in the early 6th century. It establishes a physical context for the disruptions that follow. This establishes volcanism as a plausible and, within current evidence, the most parsimonious explanation for the observed atmospheric effects. Volcanic forcing is further supported by the temporal correspondence between sulfate deposition and tree ring growth suppression. Large eruptions in the instrumental period, such as those of the 19th and 20th centuries, demonstrate a well-established relationship between stratospheric aerosols and surface cooling. The climatic response observed in proxy data for 536 to 537 AD aligns with these documented mechanisms. This correspondence does not prove causation in a strict experimental sense, but it provides strong inferential support. While volcanism is widely accepted as the general cause, significant uncertainty remains regarding the number, location, and precise timing of eruptions involved. One unresolved question concerns whether the 536 sulfate signal reflects a single massive eruption or a sequence of closely spaced events. Ice core records sometimes show complex sulfate profiles rather than a single sharp peak, which can be interpreted in multiple ways. In some cores, elevated sulfate persists for more than 1 year, suggesting either prolonged atmospheric residence or multiple injections. Another area of debate concerns eruption latitude. Tropical eruptions typically distribute aerosols globally through stratospheric circulation, producing relatively symmetric effects across hemispheres. High-latitude eruptions, particularly in the northern hemisphere, can also generate substantial cooling but may produce more asymmetric impacts. Geochemical analysis of microscopic volcanic glass fragments, or tephra, preserved in some ice cores has been used to argue for a high-latitude northern hemisphere source, possibly in the North Atlantic region. Proposed locations include Icelandic volcanic systems, though definitive attribution remains elusive. The uncertainty surrounding the eruption location reflects limitations in the surviving evidence. Tephra fragments from 6th century eruptions are rare and often too small for confident geochemical fingerprinting. Many large eruptions do not leave easily identifiable tephra deposits in distant ice cores. Consequently, the absence of a clear geochemical match does not invalidate volcanic causation. It highlights the constraints of the available data. A related question concerns eruption magnitude. Estimates of sulfur dioxide injection are derived indirectly from sulfate concentrations in ice cores, adjusted for deposition efficiency and atmospheric transport. These estimates suggest that the 536 event ranks among the larger eruptions of the last 2 millennia, though precise comparison is complicated by differences in ice core resolution and preservation. The scale inferred is sufficient to account for the observed climatic effects without invoking additional mechanisms. The possibility of non-volcanic causes has also been examined. Hypotheses involving cometary impacts, meteor airbursts, or cosmic dust influx have appeared intermittently in both scholarly and popular literature. These explanations generally propose that extraterrestrial material entered the atmosphere, producing a dust veil that reduced sunlight. However, such hypotheses lack supporting physical evidence. Ice core records do not show signatures consistent with large meteoritic input, such as elevated iridium concentrations or distinctive extraterrestrial isotopic ratios. Astronomical records from the period do not describe impacts or sustained meteor phenomena corresponding to 536 AD. As a result, non-volcanic explanations are not supported by current evidence. Another alternative explanation sometimes proposed involves large-scale biomass burning. Extensive wildfires can inject aerosols into the atmosphere, but their capacity to produce hemispheric cooling comparable to that observed in 536 is limited. Charcoal records from sediment cores do not indicate a global or hemispheric spike in fire activity at this time sufficient to account for the observed sulfate deposition and cooling. Fire-related aerosols also differ chemically from volcanic sulfate, further reducing the plausibility of this explanation. The rejection of non-volcanic hypotheses is based on the absence of corroborating data rather than on theoretical impossibility. Historical analysis must remain open to revision if new evidence emerges. At present, however, Volcanic forcing remains the only explanation consistent with the full range of proxy data. The relationship between the 536 event and a subsequent sulfate spike around 540 AD introduces further complexity. Ice core records indicate another significant aerosol injection in the early 540s, likely reflecting a separate volcanic eruption. This later event appears distinct in timing and geochemical characteristics from the 536 signal. The existence of multiple eruptions within a short interval complicates efforts to attribute specific climatic effects to a single cause. It also underscores the importance of viewing the mid-6th century anomaly as a sequence rather than an isolated incident. The recognition of multiple eruptions does not weaken the causal link between volcanism and the observed climate anomalies. Instead, it reinforces the conclusion that volcanic activity played a central role in shaping environmental conditions during this period. What remains uncertain is how these events interacted, whether their effects overlapped, and how long their combined influence persisted. Historical sources do not record volcanic eruptions in 536 AD or nearby years. This absence is not surprising. Volcanic eruptions often occurred in remote or sparsely populated regions, and even large eruptions could go unrecorded if they did not directly affect major population centers. Moreover, late antique authors lacked the conceptual framework to recognize distant volcanism as the cause of atmospheric phenomena experienced locally. Silence in the textual record does not argue against volcanic causation. Archaeological evidence likewise offers limited direct insight into eruption sites. While some regions show signs of stress or disruption in the late 530s, these patterns cannot be traced unambiguously to volcanism. Archaeology contributes primarily by establishing that social and economic changes occurred within the same temporal window as the environmental anomaly, not by identifying its origin. Modern climate modeling has been used to test the plausibility of volcanic scenarios for 536 AD. Simulations incorporating large stratospheric sulfate injections produce cooling patterns consistent with proxy reconstructions, including stronger summer cooling in continental interiors and high latitudes. These models also replicate the persistence of climatic effects over multiple years, particularly when eruptions occur in close succession. While models are simplifications of complex systems, their alignment with empirical data strengthens confidence in volcanic forcing as the primary driver. Causal plurality remains essential. Volcanism explains the initiation of atmospheric and climatic anomalies, but it does not account for all subsequent developments. The severity of agricultural disruption, the degree of economic strain, and the extent of human suffering depended on regional conditions and institutional responses. Volcanic forcing created adverse conditions. It did not determine outcomes in a uniform or mechanistic way. The debate over causes also illustrates the limits of historical certainty. Even with advanced scientific techniques, precise attribution of ancient events can remain elusive. The goal of historical analysis in this context is not to eliminate uncertainty, but to constrain it. By identifying which explanations are consistent with available evidence and which are not, scholars can narrow the range of plausible causes. At present, the balance of evidence supports the conclusion that one or more large explosive volcanic eruptions occurred around 536 AD, injecting sulfate aerosols into the stratosphere and producing widespread climatic effects. The exact location, number, and magnitude of these eruptions remain subjects of ongoing research. Subsequent volcanic activity around 540 AD likely compounded these effects, contributing to prolonged environmental stress. This causal framework rests on multiple independent lines of evidence: ice core chemistry, dendrochronological reconstructions, climate modeling, and the absence of alternative explanations supported by physical data. It is consistent with the established understanding of volcanic impacts in both ancient and modern contexts. At the same time, it remains open to refinement as new data emerge. The identification of volcanism as the most plausible cause of the 536 anomaly provides a critical explanatory foundation. It connects the physical evidence of atmospheric change to a known class of natural events capable of producing such effects. This connection allows subsequent analysis to move beyond description toward understanding how externally driven environmental stress interacted with human systems during the mid-6th century. The environmental anomaly identified in 536 AD did not remain. The climatic effects reconstructed for 536 to 537 AD, summer cooling on the order of 1.5 to 2.5 degrees Celsius in some regions, along with shortened growing seasons, would have affected these requirements directly. Tree-ring evidence indicating suppressed growth in 536 and 537 AD implies reduced photosynthetic activity and cooler conditions during the growing season. While tree growth is not a direct proxy for crop yields, both respond to similar climatic constraints. Cooler summers delay grain ripening and increase the risk that harvests occur before full maturation. In regions operating close to subsistence margins, such delays could result in lower yields or partial crop failure. Contemporary written sources provide indirect confirmation of these pressures. John of Ephesus associates the prolonged dimming of the sun with famine and hardship in parts of the Near East. His account does not provide quantitative detail or specify exact locations, but it reflects an awareness that agricultural production had been affected. Cassiodorus, writing in Italy, emphasizes altered seasonal expectations and weakened solar heat, conditions that would have disrupted planting and harvest schedules for estate managers and landholders. The Irish annalistic tradition, though compiled later, records years of bread failure and scarcity associated with the mid-6th century. These entries are retrospective and lack precise dating, but they indicate that subsistence disruption was remembered in regions at the northwestern edge of Europe. Because these annals compress events and often associate multiple years with a single entry, they cannot be used to reconstruct exact sequences. Their value lies in corroborating that food shortages occurred during this general period. Archaeological evidence provides further, though uneven, support. In some rural regions of northern and central Europe, settlement layers dating to the late 530s and early 540s show signs of stress, such as reduced building activity or changes in material deposition. In Scandinavia, where agriculture was constrained by shorter growing seasons, pollen records and settlement archaeology suggest episodes of reduced cultivation and possible abandonment of marginal farmland during the mid-6th century. These changes are not synchronous everywhere and cannot be attributed solely to climate, but they align temporally with the environmental anomaly. It is essential to distinguish between food insecurity, famine conditions, and mortality. Food insecurity refers to the reduced availability or reliability of food supplies. Famine conditions involve acute shortages that force populations to alter consumption, draw down reserves, or rely on alternative food sources. Mortality implies excess deaths attributable to starvation or related causes. For the years 536 to 539 AD, surviving evidence supports the presence of food insecurity and, in some regions, famine conditions. It does not allow for reliable quantification of mortality. No census data or burial records exist that would permit calculation of death tolls attributable to hunger in this period. Changes in burial frequency observed archaeologically can result from many factors, including shifts in burial practice. As a result, claims of mass mortality directly caused by famine in the late 530s must be treated with caution. The evidence supports stress and disruption, not precise demographic outcomes. State mechanisms could mitigate or exacerbate subsistence stress. In the Eastern Roman Empire, the Annonus system channeled grain from surplus regions, particularly Egypt, to urban centers. This system depended on regular Nile floods, functioning administration, and secure transport routes. There is no evidence that the Nile flood failed catastrophically in 536 or 537 AD, though minor deviations could have affected yields. Administrative continuity suggests that grain shipments continued, at least in the early phase of the crisis. However, state redistribution primarily served cities and the military. Rural populations depended largely on local production and household reserves. In years of poor harvest, these reserves could be depleted quickly. The cumulative effect of multiple suboptimal harvests would have been more severe than a single bad year. If cooling persisted into 537 and beyond, households that survived an initial shortfall might have faced greater vulnerability in subsequent seasons. In the Near East and Sasanian territories, irrigation-based agriculture offered both resilience and risk. Well-maintained canals could buffer against rainfall variability, but they required continuous labor and administrative oversight. Disruption of labor supply or damage to infrastructure could magnify the effects of climatic stress. John of Ephesus references to famine suggest that some communities experienced such compounded difficulties, though the geographic extent remains uncertain. In East Asia, Chinese dynastic histories record episodes of poor harvests and social unrest during the mid-6th century, though these are often intertwined with the political instability of the northern and southern dynasties period. Climatic reconstructions based on tree rings and historical climate data indicate cooling during the same interval. As with Europe and the Near East, the interaction between environmental stress and existing political conditions shaped outcomes. Trade networks could mitigate local shortages by moving food from surplus to deficit regions. Evidence from amphora distributions indicates continued movement of agricultural products in the Mediterranean during the 530s. However, trade capacity was finite and depended on navigable routes, security, and purchasing power. Cooler conditions affecting multiple regions simultaneously would have reduced the availability of surplus, limiting the effectiveness of redistribution. The timing of subsistence stress is also significant. Agricultural cycles operate on annual rhythms. Modern climate reconstructions suggest that 536 and 537 were among the coldest summers of the millennium in parts of the Northern Hemisphere. Such conditions would have delayed harvests and increased the risk of spoilage. Grain harvested late or under damp conditions is more susceptible to mold and loss. These factors, while rarely recorded explicitly in historical sources, are well documented in agronomic studies and help explain why reduced irradiance translated into subsistence stress. The response to food shortages varied socially. Elite landowners often possessed larger reserves and greater access to trade networks. Urban populations might receive state-distributed grain. Marginal rural communities, pastoralists, and those dependent on single crops were more exposed. This uneven distribution of risk explains why historical sources record hardship without implying universal famine. Religious and charitable institutions could provide limited relief. Churches and monasteries sometimes distributed food to the poor, as reflected in hagiographical sources. Such accounts, however, are often stylized and cannot be used to assess scale. They do indicate that contemporaries perceived food shortages as significant enough to warrant an organized response. It is also important to avoid retroactively linking subsistence stress in 536 to 539 AD to later events such as pandemics or political transformations without intermediate evidence. While nutritional stress can increase vulnerability to disease, the presence of food shortages does not imply immediate or inevitable epidemiological consequences. Each link in such chains must be supported independently. The concept of resilience is central to understanding this phase. Many communities endured the initial shock through adaptive strategies, consuming reserves, altering diets, or relying on social networks. Resilience, however, has limits. Prolonged or repeated stress erodes adaptive capacity. The years following 536 represent a period in which resilience was tested, with outcomes diverging by region and social structure. Quantitative estimates of yield reduction remain speculative. No direct yield records survive from this period. Proxy-based reconstructions suggest that even a 10 to 20% reduction in average yields, sustained over multiple years, could have severe consequences in subsistence-based economies. These figures are illustrative rather than definitive and are used to contextualize, not quantify, historical experience. The archaeological record also indicates continuity alongside stress. Many rural settlements remained occupied through the late 530s. Urban centers did not disappear. Coin circulation continued. These observations reinforce the conclusion that subsistence stress did not equate to immediate collapse. Instead, it marked a phase of strain within functioning systems. The interaction between climate and subsistence during 536 to 539 AD thus illustrates the complexity of historical causation. Environmental forcing created adverse conditions. Agricultural systems responded according to their design and constraints. Social and political institutions mediated outcomes unevenly. The years 536 to 539 AD represent a period in which environmental stress moved from the realm of abnormal observation into the material conditions of daily life for many communities across Eurasia. The subsistence pressures evident in the late 530s intersected with existing administrative and economic structures across Eurasia. The years from approximately 536 to 541 AD reveal how states, local authorities, and market systems adjusted to altered environmental conditions. The available evidence indicates neither uniform collapse nor seamless continuity. Instead, responses varied by region, institutional capacity, and exposure to prolonged stress. In the Eastern Roman Empire, fiscal and administrative systems remained operational during the initial years following 536 AD. Imperial taxation, primarily assessed on agricultural land, continued to be collected, as indicated by the uninterrupted production of coinage in Constantinople and provincial mints. Gold solidi and copper denominations from the late 530s attest to ongoing state payments to soldiers and officials. Numismatic continuity suggests that the imperial government did not immediately relax fiscal demands in response to environmental stress. Written sources provide limited but informative insight into administrative conditions. Procopius narratives of military campaigns during this period, particularly in the eastern provinces and the Balkans, presuppose functioning logistics and revenue streams. Armies could not be supplied or paid without reliable taxation and redistribution. This evidence indicates that the central state retained capacity even as agricultural output may have declined in some regions. At the same time, administrative resilience had limits. Taxation systems were calibrated to average yields rather than prolonged shortfalls. If harvests were reduced across multiple years, the burden of taxation could become heavier relative to actual production. While direct records of tax arrears from this period do not survive later legal texts, an administrative correspondence suggests that arrears and petitions for relief were recurrent features of late antique governance during times of stress. Cassiodorus' correspondence from Italy illustrates how administrators responded rhetorically and practically to altered conditions. His emphasis on unusual seasonal patterns and weakened solar heat indicates awareness that agricultural expectations could not be assumed. Although Italy in the late 530s was politically distinct from the Eastern Roman core, the administrative culture reflected similar concerns: estate productivity, grain supply, and the maintenance of order under abnormal circumstances. Markets provided another mechanism of adjustment. Prices for staple goods were not systematically recorded in the 6th century, but indirect indicators suggest volatility. Reduced supply in one region could raise prices, incentivizing merchants to move grain where profit margins were higher. Such movements, however, depended on transportation infrastructure, security, and purchasing power. Climatic stress affecting multiple regions simultaneously would have constrained surplus availability, limiting the stabilizing role of markets. Urban centers were particularly sensitive to supply disruptions. Cities relied on external provisioning and could not sustain their populations on local production alone. The Eastern Roman capital depended heavily on Egyptian grain shipments. While there is no evidence that these shipments ceased in the late 530s, even modest reductions or delays could have affected urban food security. Administrative systems were designed to prioritize cities and the military, potentially shifting the burden of scarcity onto rural populations. In the Near East and Sasanian territories, administrative responses are less well documented but can be inferred from archaeological and later textual evidence. Irrigation networks require maintenance to function effectively. Environmental stress could reduce labor availability, either through migration or increased mortality, making it harder to sustain canals and fields. Where administrative oversight weakened, the productivity of irrigation-based agriculture could decline rapidly. Chinese dynastic histories from the mid-6th century record episodes of tax adjustment, relief measures, and social unrest during periods of poor harvest. While these texts reflect a different political and cultural context, they demonstrate that state responses to climatic stress often included attempts to mitigate hardship through policy changes. The effectiveness of such measures varied. and they were constrained by the broader political instability of the northern and southern dynasties period. Economic adjustment also occurred at the household level. Archaeological evidence from rural settlements indicates changes in consumption patterns, such as shifts toward hardier crops or increased reliance on pastoral resources where available. These adaptations reflect practical responses to environmental stress rather than centralized planning. Their success depended on local ecology and social organization. Long-distance trade networks showed signs of strain but did not collapse uniformly. Amphora evidence indicates continued movement of goods across the Mediterranean into the late 530s and early 540s. However, changes in amphora types and distribution patterns suggest shifts in supply sources and demand. Such changes are consistent with adaptive reorganization rather than systemic failure. The military dimension adds another layer of complexity. Ongoing conflicts in the Eastern Roman world during this period required sustained resource extraction. Military expenditure could divert resources away from civilian consumption, exacerbating subsistence stress in affected regions. Conversely, the presence of armies could stimulate local economies through spending, partially offsetting shortages. The net effect depended on local circumstances. It is important to note that administrative strain does not equate to administrative collapse. The evidence supports a picture of systems under pressure but still functioning. Laws continued to be issued, coins minted, and infrastructure maintained, at least in core regions. Peripheral areas with weaker integration into state systems likely experienced greater disruption, though documentation is sparse. Regional differentiation remains central. In areas with diversified economies and access to trade, adjustment was more feasible. In marginal zones dependent on single crops or limited exchange, stress translated more directly into hardship. Northern Europe, with shorter growing seasons and less developed administrative redistribution, appears to have been particularly vulnerable, as suggested by archaeological and later analytic evidence. Modern scholarship emphasizes that economic and administrative responses to climatic stress are mediated by institutional capacity. The mid-6th century provides a case study in how a complex agrarian economy responded to external environmental forcing. The persistence of administrative functions in some regions demonstrates resilience, while signs of strain reveal vulnerabilities. Quantitative reconstruction of economic impact remains limited. Estimates of production decline, price inflation, or fiscal shortfall are necessarily speculative. Historians rely instead on qualitative indicators, continuity of coinage, references to altered seasons, settlement patterns, and later memory of hardship. These indicators point toward adjustment under constraint rather than immediate systemic breakdown. The years up to approximately 541 AD also coincide with continued environmental variability. Proxy data suggests that cooling did not abruptly end after 537. Instead, conditions fluctuated, with some years offering partial recovery and others renewing stress. This variability would have complicated planning and recovery, forcing administrators and households to operate under uncertainty. Institutional responses could also generate secondary effects. Attempts to maintain tax revenues during poor harvests could deepen rural distress. Conversely, temporary relief could undermine long-term fiscal stability. The balance between extraction and accommodation was a persistent challenge in pre-industrial states, made more acute by environmental anomalies. The evidence does not support a narrative of uniform economic collapse triggered directly by climatic events. Instead, it reveals a period of adjustment marked by uneven outcomes. Some regions maintained relative stability, others experienced prolonged hardship, and many oscillated between these states as conditions changed. The administrative and economic dimension of the late 530s thus illustrates how environmental stress translated into social consequences through existing structures. Climate acted as an external constraint, but the shape and severity of economic impact were determined by institutional responses, regional conditions, and cumulative effects over time. In the early 540s AD, a new and distinct crisis emerged across the eastern Mediterranean and adjacent regions. A large-scale epidemic later known as the Justinianic. This identification is supported by ancient DNA recovered from 6th century burial sites in Europe, which confirms the presence of Y. pestis strains genetically distinct from those responsible for later medieval outbreaks. The convergence of textual description and genetic evidence provides a strong basis for this identification. The timing of the epidemic is relatively well constrained. Procopius places its arrival in Constantinople in the spring or early summer of 542 AD. Other sources, including John of Ephesus, corroborate this chronology and emphasize the prolonged nature of the outbreak. John describes waves of illness affecting different regions at different times, with some areas experiencing repeated episodes over several years. The geographic spread of the plague extended beyond the Eastern Roman Empire. Later sources and archaeological evidence indicate its presence in parts of the Western Mediterranean, the Near East, and possibly the Sasanian Empire. The precise extent of its reach remains debated, as documentation outside the Roman world is more limited. Nevertheless, the available evidence supports the conclusion that the epidemic affected a broad swath of Eurasia. Quantifying mortality presents significant challenges. Procopius offers figures suggesting extraordinarily high death tolls in Constantinople, at times claiming tens of thousands of deaths per day. Modern historians treat such numbers with caution. Late antique authors often employed large figures rhetorically to convey severity rather than statistical precision. Archaeological indicators, such as mass burial sites, support the occurrence of elevated mortality but do not allow for precise quantification at the imperial or regional level. John of Ephesus provides qualitative descriptions of social disruption, including labor shortages and difficulties in maintaining basic services. He notes that agricultural work was interrupted and that corpses sometimes remained unburied due to a lack of manpower. These observations align with expectations for a severe epidemic, but do not specify. In Gaul and the Western Mediterranean, political fragmentation shaped responses. Successor kingdoms maintained varying degrees of administrative continuity. Archaeological surveys indicate that many rural settlements persisted through the mid-6th century, though with signs of economic simplification. Coin circulation declined in some areas, suggesting reduced monetization rather than total economic breakdown. The limited reach of centralized redistribution made these regions more dependent on local resilience and adaptation. Northern Europe exhibits clearer signs of disruption. Archaeological evidence from Scandinavia and parts of northern Germany indicates settlement contraction, changes in burial practices, and a reduction in elite material culture during the mid-6th century. Dendrochronological data suggest that cooler conditions affected marginal agricultural zones more severely. Later literary traditions, though composed centuries afterward, preserve memories of hardship that align with these material indicators. The absence of strong, centralized institutions limited the capacity to mitigate prolonged stress. The Near East presents a more complex picture. Some regions, particularly those reliant on irrigation, faced challenges in maintaining infrastructure amid labor shortages and environmental variability. John of Ephesus describes famine and disease affecting communities in Syria and Mesopotamia during the 540s. At the same time, urban centers such as Antioch and Alexandria continued to function, albeit with interruptions. The persistence of trade routes and administrative oversight moderated outcomes in core areas. The Sasanian Empire experienced pressures comparable in scale, but different in configuration. Written evidence is more limited, yet archaeological data indicate continued occupation of major cities and maintenance of agricultural systems in some regions. Diplomatic and military interactions with the Eastern Roman Empire continued through the 540s, implying that state capacity remained substantial. The plague's presence in Sasanian territories is suggested by later sources, but its demographic impact is difficult to assess. As with the Roman world, outcomes varied by region. In East Asia, the mid-6th century coincided with political fragmentation under the northern and southern dynasties. Chinese historical records note poor harvests, epidemics, and social unrest during the 540s, though these phenomena are intertwined with warfare and regime change. Climatic reconstructions indicate cooling consistent with Northern Hemisphere trends. State responses included relief measures and tax adjustments, but persistent instability limited their effectiveness. The interaction of climate, disease, and politics produced regionally specific outcomes rather than a uniform crisis. Social structures influenced how communities absorbed stress. Elites with access to land, reserves, and political connections were better positioned to endure prolonged disruption. Peasant households, particularly those dependent on single harvests, faced greater vulnerability. Archaeological evidence of dietary change and altered consumption patterns reflects adaptive strategies, but also points to constrained options. Migration is often proposed as a response to mid-6th century stress, but evidence remains limited. Some settlement abandonment in northern regions may reflect population movement, but alternative explanations, such as reorganization or consolidation, cannot be excluded. The sources do not support large-scale, coordinated migrations directly attributable to the events of the 540s. Where movement occurred, it was likely localized and contingent. Religious and cultural responses varied. Some communities interpreted hardship within theological frameworks, while others focused on practical adaptation. Ecclesiastical sources emphasize charity and moral exhortation, but provide limited insight into demographic scale. These texts illuminate contemporary perception rather than offering quantitative data. The interaction between plague and political authority is particularly instructive. Despite significant mortality, states did not uniformly disintegrate. Administrative adaptation, including adjustments to labor obligations and fiscal practices, allowed continued governance. Where collapse occurred, it resulted from the convergence of multiple pressures rather than from disease alone. Archaeological continuity in many regions cautions against narratives of universal decline. Settlements persisted, fields were cultivated, and crafts continued, albeit sometimes at reduced intensity. These patterns indicate that the mid-6th century crisis altered trajectories without extinguishing social complexity. By 550 AD, signs of partial stabilization appear in some datasets. Tree ring records indicate a gradual climatic recovery in certain regions. Coinage and trade show adaptation rather than cessation. The plague receded in many areas, though the potential for recurrence remained. These developments suggest that the crisis phase initiated in 536 did not produce a single endpoint, but rather a reconfiguration of conditions. The period from 542 to 550 AD thus illustrates the importance of regional differentiation in historical analysis. Environmental and epidemiological shocks imposed constraints, but outcomes depended on local ecology, institutional capacity, and social organization. Uniform labels obscure this complexity. Modern scholarship emphasizes that the significance of this period lies not in declaring a singular collapse, but in understanding how interconnected systems responded to compounded stress. Some regions experienced contraction, others adaptation, and still others continuity with modification. These divergent paths challenge simplistic assessments of the mid-6th century. The evidence supports a model of uneven transformation rather than synchronized decline. Political authority persisted in some areas, weakened in others, and adapted in still others. Social hierarchies shifted, economic practices adjusted, and cultural frameworks responded to changing conditions. By examining regional outcomes in detail, it becomes possible to move beyond generalized claims and assess the specific ways in which the crisis of the mid-6th century reshaped Eurasian societies. The years leading up to 550 AD represent a phase of divergence, in which the consequences of earlier shocks played out according to local conditions and capacities. By the middle of the 6th century, the sequence of shocks that began in 536 AD had unfolded across more than a decade. Environmental anomaly, subsistence stress, administrative adjustment, epidemic disease, and regional divergence had interacted in complex ways. The period from approximately 545 to 550 AD represents a phase in which societies across Eurasia confronted the cumulative effects of these pressures while also exhibiting signs of stabilization, adaptation, and, in some cases, structural transformation. Evaluating this phase requires careful attention to both continuity and change, and to the limits of the available evidence. Climatic proxy data indicate that the most severe cooling associated with the mid-6th century volcanic events gradually moderated after the early 540s. Tree ring reconstructions from several Northern Hemisphere regions show partial recovery and growth by the late 540s, though variability remained high. This does not imply a return to pre-536 conditions in a uniform or immediate manner. Instead, it suggests that the extraordinary atmospheric forcing that characterized the late 530s had diminished, allowing climatic systems to resume patterns closer to longer-term norms. The environmental recovery, however, did not erase the social and economic consequences accumulated during the preceding years. Agricultural systems required time to rebuild reserves depleted by consecutive poor harvests. In regions where marginal land had been abandoned or irrigation infrastructure damaged, recovery depended on labor availability and institutional capacity. Archaeological evidence indicates that some areas resumed cultivation quickly, while others experienced longer-term contraction or reorganization. In the Eastern Roman Empire, administrative continuity remained evident through the later 542s. Coinage continued to be minted, legal texts issued, and military forces deployed. The ability of the state to maintain these functions suggests that, despite heavy strain, core institutions retained resilience. At the same time, fiscal pressure likely increased as a result of population loss, reduced productivity, and the costs associated with military campaigns and epidemic response. Direct documentation of fiscal reform during this precise interval is limited, but later 6th century legal materials imply ongoing adjustments to labor obligations and taxation. Urban centers displayed mixed trajectories. Constantinople recovered from the acute phase of the plague by the mid-540s, though later recurrences remained possible. Archaeological evidence suggests continued occupation and public life, albeit with potential changes in scale and density. Other cities, particularly those affected by warfare or repeated epidemics, show signs of contraction. These patterns underscore that recovery was uneven and contingent. In Italy, prolonged conflict compounded the effects of earlier environmental and epidemiological stress. Archaeological layers from the late 540s and early 550s indicate a continued decline in urban infrastructure and artisanal production in some areas. This outcome reflects the intersection of multiple stressors rather than the legacy of climatic anomaly alone. Rural landscapes likewise show varied responses, with some estates maintaining production and others fragmenting or disappearing from the archaeological record. Northern Europe appears to have experienced longer-lasting demographic and economic effects. Settlement contraction in parts of Scandinavia and northern Germany persisted into the later 6th century. Changes in burial practices and material culture suggest shifts in social organization and elite display. While it is difficult to isolate the role of mid-6th century events from longer-term trends, the timing supports the interpretation that environmental and subsistence stress contributed to lasting regional change. In the Near East, recovery trajectories differed by locality. Areas with robust irrigation and administrative oversight were better positioned to restore agricultural output. Regions affected by repeated outbreaks of disease or political instability faced prolonged challenges. Written sources from the later 6th century describe both continued hardship and efforts at reconstruction, reflecting a heterogeneous landscape. The Sasanian Empire similarly shows evidence of persistence alongside adjustment. Urban centers and agricultural systems continued to function, though the cumulative impact of epidemic disease and environmental variability likely influenced labor availability and fiscal capacity. Diplomatic and military engagement with the Eastern Roman Empire continued into the later 542, indicating sustained state activity. The absence of detailed demographic data, however, limits assessment of population recovery. In East Asia, the mid-6th century remained a period of political fragmentation. Climatic reconstructions suggest gradual moderation after earlier cooling, but social outcomes were shaped primarily by warfare and regime change. Chinese historical records describe continued relief efforts and administrative reforms aimed at stabilizing agrarian production. These measures highlight the capacity of states to respond to environmental stress when institutional continuity was preserved. One of the central historiographical questions concerns whether the events initiated in 536 AD produced a long-term demographic decline across Eurasia. Archaeological surveys in some regions indicate continuity of settlement density into the later 6th century, while others show a reduction. The absence of comprehensive population data makes broad generalization difficult. Current scholarship tends to reject models of uniform demographic collapse, emphasizing instead regionally specific trajectories. Another area of debate involves economic transformation. Some historians argue that the mid-6th century crisis accelerated trends toward economic simplification, reduced monetization, and localized exchange, particularly in Western Europe. Others emphasize evidence for continued trade and production, albeit at altered scales. Amphora distributions and coin finds from the late 540s support the view that economic networks adapted rather than disappeared. The concept of resilience is useful, but must be applied carefully. Resilience does not imply the absence of suffering or loss. It refers to the capacity of systems to absorb shock and continue functioning, sometimes in a modified form. The evidence from 545 to 550 AD suggests that many societies retained this capacity, though often at the cost of reduced complexity or altered priorities. It is also important to consider memory and perception. Later sources sometimes retrospectively portray the mid-6th century as a time of exceptional hardship. Such portrayals may conflate multiple events or reflect later concerns rather than contemporary experience. Distinguishing between immediate impact and long-term memory is essential for accurate historical interpretation. The question of whether 536 AD merits designation as the worst year in recorded human history depends on the criteria. From an environmental perspective, the magnitude and abruptness of the atmospheric anomaly are exceptional within the last 2 millennia. From a human perspective, the severity of subsequent crises varied widely. Some regions endured prolonged hardship, while others recovered relatively quickly. No single metric captures this diversity of experience. By 550 AD, the immediate phase of the crisis initiated in 536 had largely passed. Climatic conditions stabilized, epidemic intensity diminished in many areas, and administrative systems adapted to altered circumstances. Yet the decade left enduring marks. Population distributions, economic practices, and political trajectories had shifted in ways that shaped subsequent history. Modern interdisciplinary research has transformed the understanding of this period by integrating textual, archaeological, and environmental evidence. This approach reveals a complex interplay of factors rather than a singular catastrophic narrative. The mid-6th century crisis emerges as a sequence of overlapping challenges that tested the limits of pre-industrial societies. The long-term consequences of these challenges were not predetermined. They depended on choices made by individuals, communities, and states within constraints imposed by the environment and disease. Some adaptations fostered recovery, others entrenched vulnerability. The diversity of outcomes cautions against simplistic judgments. Assessing the legacy of 536 AD thus requires balance. The year marks the onset of an extraordinary environmental disturbance with wide-reaching effects. It does not, by itself, explain all subsequent developments of the mid-6th century. Its significance lies in how it initiated a chain of stresses that interacted with existing conditions. The period from 545 to 550 AD demonstrates both the capacity for recovery and the persistence of change. Societies did not return seamlessly to earlier norms, nor did they uniformly collapse. Instead, they navigated a constrained landscape shaped by recent experience. This perspective underscores a broader historical principle. Extreme events rarely operate in isolation. Their impact unfolds over time, mediated by social structures, and human agency. The mid-6th century offers a well-documented example of how environmental shock can reshape historical trajectories without dictating a single outcome. Assessing whether 536 AD can be characterized as the worst year in recorded human history requires methodological clarity. Such an assessment does not rest on rhetorical impact or isolated catastrophe, but on comparative evaluation across defined criteria. These criteria typically include the scale and abruptness of environmental disruption, the breadth of geographic impact, the degree of human suffering as evidenced by subsistence failure and mortality, and the extent to which social and political systems were destabilized. Each criterion must be evaluated using documented evidence and with explicit acknowledgement of uncertainty. The environmental signal associated with 536 AD is exceptional by several measurable standards. Ice core sulfate records indicate one of the largest aerosol loading events of the last 2 millennia, with hemispheric reach. Dendrochronological data identify 536 and 537 among the coldest growing seasons in many northern hemisphere regions during the first millennium. The combination of abrupt onset, wide geographic distribution, and multi-year persistence distinguishes this event from more localized or shorter-lived climatic anomalies. From an environmental perspective alone, a few years in recorded history present a comparable profile. Comparison with other well-documented climatic catastrophes illustrates this point. The eruption of Tambora in 1815 AD produced the year without a summer in 1816, with widespread crop failure and social disruption. Instrumental records confirm severe cooling, and contemporary documentation is extensive. However, Tambora occurred within an industrializing world with expanding global trade and more robust state capacities in many regions. While suffering was significant, particularly in Europe and North America, recovery mechanisms differed markedly from those available in the 6th century. The pre-industrial context of 536 magnified vulnerability to climatic shock. Earlier events, such as the late Bronze Age climatic downturn around 1200 BC, involved prolonged aridification and societal transformation across the eastern Mediterranean. These processes unfolded over decades rather than arising from a single, abrupt atmospheric event. Their cumulative impact was profound, but their temporal profile differs from the sharp onset observed in 536 AD. The distinction between rapid shock and long-term transition is central to comparative evaluation. The human consequences of the mid-6th century crisis are more difficult to quantify than environmental parameters. Contemporary sources attest to food shortages, famine conditions in some regions, and later epidemic disease. Archaeological evidence corroborates stress and disruption, but also reveals continuity and adaptation. Unlike later periods with parish registers or census data, the 6th century offers no reliable means of calculating aggregate mortality. As a result, claims that 536 AD produced the highest death toll of any year in history cannot be substantiated. This limitation does not negate severity. It constrains how severity can be measured. The evidence supports widespread hardship affecting large populations across Eurasia, but it does not permit precise ranking based on mortality alone. Any assertion that 536 AD was definitively worse than years associated with the Black Death, the Mongol conquests, or 20th century global conflicts would exceed the limits of the evidence. Geographic breadth is a more tractable criterion. The environmental anomaly of 536 AD affected much of the northern hemisphere and likely extended into parts of the southern hemisphere. Written sources document effects across the Eastern Roman world, Western Europe, and the Near East, while proxy data indicate cooling in Central and East Asia. Few historical events combine such breadth with clear temporal coherence. Many catastrophic years are regionally confined. 536 stands out for its hemispheric scope. Political and social destabilization offers another basis for comparison. The mid-6th century did not witness uniform state collapse. Major polities persisted, adapted, and in some cases expanded territorially. This distinguishes 536 from periods marked by synchronized political breakdown. However, the crisis imposed sustained strain on institutions, reduced margins for error, and altered trajectories. The absence of collapse does not imply the absence of severity. It reflects resilience within constraint. The addition of the Justinianic Plague complicates comparative assessment. Epidemic disease emerged several years after the initial environmental shock, yet within the same broader crisis interval. From a chronological standpoint, 536 AD marks the onset of conditions that preceded the epidemic rather than the epidemic itself. Evaluations that conflate the year 536 with the peak mortality of the plague risk chronological imprecision. At the same time, separating these phenomena would obscure their cumulative effect. Historiographically, the framing of 536 AD as the worst year is a product of modern synthesis rather than ancient perception. Contemporary authors did not rank years by severity or conceive of global history. Their accounts record abnormality and hardship within local frames of reference. The superlative characterization arises from the convergence of multiple lines of modern evidence, textual, archaeological, and scientific, assembled across disciplines. This convergence raises methodological challenges. Interdisciplinary synthesis can reveal patterns invisible within single-source traditions, but it also risks overstating coherence. Not all regions experienced identical outcomes. Not all societies were equally affected. The language of worst year simplifies a complex temporal process into a single label. Historians must distinguish between heuristic value and literal accuracy. From a heuristic standpoint, 536 AD serves as a useful marker. It identifies a moment when environmental forcing exceeded normal variability and initiated a sequence of stresses lasting more than a decade. It provides a focal point for integrating diverse evidence and examining system responses to extreme shock. In this sense, the label highlights significance rather than delivering a definitive ranking. Comparative evaluation also depends on the quality of surviving evidence. The 6th century is unusually well served by both textual accounts and high-resolution environmental proxies. Earlier periods may have experienced equally severe or worse conditions without leaving comparable records. Absence of evidence limits comparison. Consequently, assessments of worst must be understood as conditional on the documentary record. Modern scholarship increasingly emphasizes this evidentiary asymmetry. The prominence of 536 AD in current discourse reflects not only the magnitude of the event, but also the availability of data capable of demonstrating that magnitude. This does not diminish its importance. It clarifies why confidence in its severity is higher than for many earlier episodes. The criteria of simultaneity and interaction further distinguish the mid-6th century. Environmental anomaly subsistence stress, administrative strain, and epidemic disease did not occur in isolation. Their temporal overlap created compounded challenges. While each factor has historical parallels, their convergence within a relatively short interval is unusual. This convergence amplifies impact without requiring claims of total collapse. When evaluated against later catastrophic years, such as those associated with world wars or pandemics in the modern era, differences in scale and context must be acknowledged. Modern catastrophes often involve higher absolute mortality due to larger populations. Pre-industrial catastrophes operate on different demographic baselines. Severity must therefore be assessed relative to capacity and vulnerability, not absolute numbers alone. Relative to 6th century population sizes and technological constraints, the shocks initiated in 536 AD imposed extraordinary stress. Cooling of several degrees, sustained over multiple growing seasons, threatened food systems that lacked mechanization or globalized trade. Epidemic disease struck populations without germ theory or effective medical intervention. Administrative systems faced simultaneous revenue shortfalls and increased demands. These conditions collectively justify the characterization of the period as one of the most severe experienced by pre-industrial societies. At the same time, the evidence counsels restraint. Recovery occurred in many regions. Institutions adapted. Cultural and economic life continued, albeit transformed. The crisis did not end history, it reshaped it. Framing 536 AD as the worst year should be understood as an analytical shorthand for exceptional convergence rather than as a literal claim of unparalleled human suffering in every dimension. The comparative question ultimately reveals as much about historical method as about the past itself. It requires balancing quantitative proxies with qualitative testimony, local experience with global patterns, and shock with resilience. It also requires acknowledging that historical severity cannot be reduced to a single metric. Within these constraints, the designation of 536 AD as the onset of one of the most severe crisis intervals in recorded history is well supported. Whether it is the worst year depends on the criteria applied and the caution exercised in interpretation. The strength of the case lies in documented environmental extremity, geographic breadth, and the cascading challenges that followed. By situating 536 AD within a comparative and methodological framework, it becomes possible to assess its significance without exaggeration. The year stands out not as an isolated catastrophe, but as the beginning of a period that tested the limits of late antique societies across Eurasia. The events and processes unfolding between 536 and 550 AD present an unusually well-documented case of compounded stress in a pre-industrial world. Yet the apparent richness of evidence should not obscure the limits of historical knowledge. The mid-6th century crisis has become a focal point of modern interdisciplinary research precisely because it sits at the intersection of written testimony, archaeological record, and high-resolution environmental proxies. Understanding its significance requires not only assembling evidence, but also examining how that evidence constrains interpretation. Written sources from the 6th century offer valuable, but partial, perspectives. Authors such as Procopius, Cassiodorus, and John of Ephesus recorded abnormal environmental conditions, administrative concerns, famine, and epidemic disease. Their accounts are anchored in specific contexts: court historiography, administrative correspondence, and ecclesiastical narrative. Each genre shapes what is observed, emphasized, or omitted. None of these authors aim to produce a comprehensive social or environmental analysis. Their writings illuminate perception and experience, not totality. Chronological precision in these sources is uneven. Years are often identified through regnal systems or retrospective compilation. Environmental phenomena are described qualitatively rather than measured. Duration is frequently expressed in approximate terms. These limitations require correlation with independent dating systems provided by natural archives. Without such correlation, the interpretation of events like the atmospheric dimming of 536 AD would remain uncertain. Archaeology provides a material context, but introduces its own constraints. Settlement patterns, building phases, and burial practices reveal change over time, yet they rarely resolve events to a single year. Archaeological layers often span decades. Absence of evidence in a given site may reflect preservation bias, excavation limits, or later disturbance rather than actual abandonment. Consequently, archaeology can demonstrate stress, continuity, or transformation, but rarely precise causation. Numismatic evidence illustrates administrative continuity and economic adaptation, but it too must be interpreted carefully. Continued minting does not guarantee prosperity, just as reduced circulation does not necessarily indicate collapse. Coins reflect state activity and exchange mechanisms, not the distribution of well-being across society. Their value lies in showing that institutions persisted and adapted under constraint. Paleoclimatic and dendrochronological data have transformed the understanding of the mid-6th century. Ice core sulfate records and tree ring series provide annual and sometimes seasonal resolution unattainable through traditional historical methods. These datasets confirm that the environmental anomaly of 536 AD was real, abrupt, and large in scale. They also show that climatic effects persisted beyond a single year, with additional volcanic activity contributing to prolonged variability. At the same time, proxy data require interpretation. Tree ring growth reflects multiple variables, including temperature, precipitation, and soil conditions. Ice core sulfate concentrations depend on deposition processes and atmospheric circulation. Translating these measurements into human experience involves inference rather than direct observation. The strength of paleoclimatic evidence lies in its independence from human perception, but it cannot, on its own, explain social outcomes. The integration of these different forms of evidence has reshaped historical methodology. Earlier generations of historians lacked access to high-resolution environmental data and therefore relied primarily on textual interpretation. This often led to debates over whether 6th century accounts exaggerated or misinterpreted natural phenomena. Modern interdisciplinary research has demonstrated that these accounts correspond to measurable environmental events, lending them greater credibility. At the same time, the availability of scientific data introduces new risks. There is a tendency, particularly outside specialist scholarship, to draw direct causal lines from environmental shock to social collapse. Such narratives appeal to simplicity but do not withstand scrutiny. The evidence from 536 to 550 AD consistently demonstrates mediated outcomes. Environmental forcing created constraints. Institutions, economies, and cultures responded in varied ways. This distinction is central to historical method. Causation in complex systems is rarely linear. The mid-6th century crisis unfolded through interaction among climate, agriculture, administration, disease, and political context. No single factor explains the full range of observed outcomes. Volcanic eruptions account for atmospheric change. They do not account for differential regional recovery. Epidemic disease explains mortality spikes. It does not explain institutional persistence. The concept of vulnerability provides a more useful framework. Vulnerability is shaped by dependence on specific crops, degree of market integration, administrative capacity, and social stratification. Regions operating close to subsistence margins were more exposed to climatic cooling. States with centralized redistribution could mitigate shortages in some areas while intensifying them in others. Epidemics exploited existing networks of trade and communication. These interactions produced uneven results. Another methodological issue concerns scale. The label global crisis must be used with precision. Proxy data indicate hemispheric environmental effects, and written sources document widespread hardship. Yet experiences were not identical across Eurasia. Some regions endured prolonged contraction. Others adapted more quickly. Historical analysis must operate simultaneously at local, regional, and hemispheric scales without collapsing these levels into a single narrative. The mid-6th century crisis also highlights the importance of temporal framing. The year 536 AD stands out because it marks the onset of extraordinary environmental conditions. The human consequences unfolded over subsequent years. Evaluations that focus narrowly on a single year risk misunderstanding processes that developed over a decade or more. Conversely, extending causation too far risks attributing later developments to earlier events without sufficient evidence. Modern historiography increasingly treats 536 to 550 AD as a crisis interval rather than a single catastrophic moment. This framing accommodates both abrupt shocks and cumulative effects. It allows for the coexistence of immediate disruption and longer-term adaptation. It also aligns more closely with the structure of the surviving evidence. Comparative history further refines interpretation. Other periods of severe climatic stress, epidemic disease, or political upheaval demonstrate similar patterns of uneven impact and mediated response. What distinguishes the mid-6th century is the convergence of independently documented environmental extremity with extensive written testimony. This convergence enhances confidence in reconstruction, not certainty of outcome. The question of memory illustrates another methodological dimension. Later medieval and early modern writers sometimes reference the 6th century as a time of great hardship. These memories were shaped by transmission, selection, and reinterpretation. Distinguishing contemporary experience from later recollection is essential. Historical severity must be assessed on contemporary evidence, not retrospective reputation. The mid-6th century crisis also informs debates about resilience and transformation. Resilience does not imply stasis. Many societies emerged from this period altered in structure, scale, or orientation. Economic networks shifted, political priorities changed, and cultural frameworks adapted. These transformations cannot be reduced to failure or success. They represent negotiated responses to constraint. From a methodological standpoint, the study of 536 to 550 AD underscores the value of interdisciplinary collaboration. No single discipline can fully account for the evidence. Historians, archaeologists, climatologists, and geneticists contribute complementary perspectives. The challenge lies in integrating these perspectives without collapsing differences in scale, certainty, or explanatory power. The limits of knowledge remain substantial. Precise mortality figures are unattainable. Exact yield losses cannot be calculated. The location and magnitude of volcanic eruptions cannot be determined with absolute certainty. These gaps do not undermine historical analysis. They define its boundaries. Responsible interpretation acknowledges uncertainty rather than filling it with conjecture. Within these boundaries, several conclusions can be sustained. The environmental anomaly beginning in 536 AD was exceptional in scale and abruptness. It initiated a period of sustained climatic variability. This variability interacted with agricultural systems, administrative structures, and disease ecology. The resulting crisis interval reshaped conditions across Eurasia between 536 and 550 AD, producing diverse outcomes. Whether this interval constitutes the most severe in recorded history depends on the criteria and perspective. The evidence supports its classification as one of the most environmentally extreme periods documented with high confidence. It also supports recognition of widespread human hardship. It does not support claims of universal collapse or singular causation. The historical value of studying this period lies less in ranking years than in understanding processes. The mid-6th century crisis provides a case study in how complex societies respond to external shocks under technological and institutional constraints. It reveals both fragility and adaptability. It demonstrates that severity and survival coexist. By adhering to evidentiary discipline and methodological clarity, the study of 536 to 550 AD avoids the extremes of minimization and sensationalism. It offers a grounded account of a period when natural forces exceeded familiar bounds and societies were compelled to adjust. The legacy of this crisis is not confined to its immediate aftermath. It has reshaped modern understanding of late antiquity, challenged linear narratives of decline or continuity, and highlighted the importance of environmental factors in historical change without reducing history to environment alone. In this sense, the mid-6th century crisis stands as a reference point for historical inquiry itself. It demonstrates how expanding sources and methods can transform interpretation while reinforcing the need for restraint. The period between 536 and 550 AD remains one of the clearest examples in recorded history of how interdisciplinary evidence can illuminate the interaction between natural events and human societies within and not beyond the limits of what the evidence allows.